What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So, in the aftermath of UFC 319, we have a lot of people wondering why the Bellator fighters aren't doing better in the UFC. Because, of course, we just saw Aaron Pico come over. He had a lot of hype behind him. The UFC was pushing him very hard. He was actually the favorite against Lerone Murphy. But what happens? He comes out, he's doing okay at first, gets knocked out in the first round with a spectacular spinning elbow. And we, of course, had Patchy Mix come over recently, and he just did terribly in his debut. We had Patricio Pitbull come over. He loses his debut, then goes on to win against Dan Ige. And people are wondering, we just saw Michael Chandler lose embarrassingly against Paddy Pimblett, and he, of course, Chandler never won the belt. So people are wondering why the Bellator guys are doing so poorly. And there's a simple answer to that, and it's that the UFC just doesn't have competition anymore. And what I mean by that is if you look at cross-promotional rankings, just overall MMA rankings, and you look at the top 15 people in virtually every division, they're almost all in the UFC. And there's a few exceptions, like the UFC let go of Muhammad Mokaev at flyweight, so of course he's a ranked guy and he's off doing something. And Francis Ngannou left the UFC, so he's arguably either the best or second best heavyweight in the world, and he's off in PFL right now doing whatever. But broadly speaking, if you look at the divisions, all the ranked guys are in the UFC already. And sure, Patricio Pitbull just beat Dan Ige, so he's now ranked, I think, number 9 or something. And so up until he was in the UFC, he would have qualified as a top 15 featherweight. Fair enough. But broadly speaking, with outside of an exception here or there, the ranked guys are all in the UFC. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon, because if you look at the history of the sport, that wasn't the case. If you go back to the era of Pride was the top promotion. They were bigger than the UFC, not just in terms of drawing viewership, but in terms of the roster. They had better fighters, especially at the heavier divisions, light heavyweight and heavyweight. They had the better roster. We saw that when UFC champions and former champions came over. Pride at the time was the best. Now, Pride, like Michael Chandler, was here for a good time, not a long time. And Pride, of course, we know the story. Their ownership had all these ties to the Yakuza. There was a lot of criminal shit going on. And 10 years after Pride's inception, it imploded on itself. And the UFC was able to outlast them and then swoop in and buy them during their decline. And even after that, though, and even after absorbing that roster, and across divisions, they got their lightweights, they got Gomi, they got all those guys. There were still other promotions that had top talent. And the two big ones were Strikeforce and WEC. Because Strikeforce at its peak had lightweights and middleweights and heavyweights especially that could compete with the UFC top guys. Because at lightweight, they had Gilbert Melendez, they had Josh Thompson. At middleweight, they had Jacare Souza, they had Tim Kennedy, they had Luke Rockhold. At heavyweight, they had Daniel Cormier, they had Josh Burnett, they had Bigfoot Silva, they had Overeem, they had Andrei Arlovsky, and several of those people either won belts in the UFC, or at least fought for belts, or at least were top 5 ranked people at some point or another. These were people who, generally speaking, were on par, or at least competitive with the UFC's roster. And WEC, it was the same story, except in that case, they had entire divisions the UFC didn't have, because the UFC didn't have bantamweight and featherweight divisions, then WEC did. So when the WEC was absorbed by the UFC, their bantamweight and featherweight rosters just got turned into the UFC bantamweight and featherweight rosters, and their champions, Dominic Cruz and Jose Aldo, just got anointed into being de facto inaugural UFC bantamweight and featherweight champions. So that's what happened there. But even at lightweight, which the UFC had their own lightweight division, of course, WEC had some top fighters. They had Donald Cerrone, they had Anthony Pettis, and they had Benson Henderson. Cerrone fought for the title, and of course is a beloved long-stay action fighter, but Henderson and Pettis won the title in the UFC, and they both defended. So those were eras where other promotions still had some top talent. And ever since they've been absorbed, so if you look at the sort of start of Pride to the end of Strikeforce and the WEC, which is something like the late 90s into the early 2010s or whatever, during that time, the UFC had competition, and you had a realistic hope if you saw some reigning champion or some elite contender in one of the other top promotions, you had some realistic hope that that guy could come over to the UFC and have success and maybe even win the belt. These days, that's just not realistic, which doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because we've had two somewhat recent examples, being Jiri Prohaska and Dricus du Plessis. Because Jiri was the Rising champion. He comes over, and granted, he wins the belt off an old version of Glover Teixeira. He's losing that fight until he gets the finish in the 5th. It's close, it's competitive, it's a great war, but he is losing until he gets the late finish. Then he vacates because he gets injured, and then he, of course, loses to Alex Pereira twice. Dricus du Plessis, more of a success story. He gets this big win streak. He wins the belt. He defends it twice. But, and if you've seen my previous videos, I've pointed out that there's some fool's gold in Dricus' title reign, because whether it's Whitaker, whether it's Izzy, whether it's Strickland, all three of those guys in all 4 of those fights were past their prime to one degree or another. And we, of course, just watched him get washed by Khamzat, and we'll see how Dricus can do in the aftermath of that. We'll see if he can take on guys like De Ridder and Fluffy Hernandez and Imanov and those guys. We'll see how he does, and we'll see where he lands in the rest of the division. We'll see how history reflects on him as in the history of the middleweight GOATs. Time will tell. But he's no longer the champion, and he's probably the best recent success story. Because other than that, you have to almost go back to like Eddie Alvarez, who was a Bellator champion, who did come over and did win the UFC gold. But there's details there. For one, Alvarez did that quite a while ago. Alvarez is he's several generations removed from the current elite crop of fighters, because he was already kind of the previous generation back in Bellator when a young undefeated Michael Chandler came up and took the belt from him. Because Chandler was, he's only a few years younger than Alvarez, but he was only like 8-0, whereas Alvarez was on his like 25th fight or something when they had their first match. And then he comes back, he wins it back, split decision against Chandler, and then he goes to the UFC. But that's a long time ago. Like, he's a generation prior to Dustin Poirier, a generation prior to Max Holloway and guys like that, a generation prior to guys like Justin Gaethje. And his success in the UFC was fortuitous, and it was short-lived, because he comes over, he loses to Donald Cerrone, and then he has 2 very controversial split decision wins over Anthony Pettis and Gilbert Melendez. He gets a title shot against RDA. He's actually kind of losing that fight, but then he catches him and knocks him out in the first round, and then he immediately gets smashed by McGregor. So, it's arguable if there was ever even a moment when Eddie Alvarez was actually the best fighter in the lightweight division. I mean? He won the belt, couldn't defend it, and you look at that landscape, you look at how he got to the title, you look at who he beat to get the belt. We look at how he lost after. We look at the guys he never even had to fight who were around at the time, like Khabib, like Tony Ferguson in their primes, and that's basically the only success story, at least at that level, at the championship level, from a Bellator fighter. And some of it's not fair, because Patricio Pitbull is not in his prime anymore. He came over old. MVP is not in his prime anymore. He came over old. Michael Chandler was not in his prime when he came over. If you follow Chandler's career in Bellator, you watched him age out of his prime in Bellator. When he got signed to the UFC, those in the know were saying, like, it's a shame he didn't get signed earlier, because now he's like a little bit past it. He's not quite at his best anymore. And he still had some success, because he won his debut against Dan Hooker, who I believe was ranked top 5 at the time, and was a tricky matchup for him, but he was able to knock him out in the first round. And then he had a very competitive fight where he got finished, admittedly, but a very competitive fight with Oliveira for the vacant belt. So Chandler still, had success of a kind, but he got his title shot, arguably unearned, and he couldn't win it. And then he just went on to lose since, save for a knockout win over a totally washed Tony Ferguson. So, again, like, the reason this is all happening, and the reason you shouldn't expect a Bellator champion to do well, the same reason you shouldn't expect a Ryzen champion to do well, and you shouldn't expect a KSW champion to do well, is because their champions and their top contenders are just not on par with the UFC's ranked fighters anymore. Like, that time has passed. There's a whole lawsuit against the UFC that happened about whether or not they are or are not a monopoly, and I only loosely followed that. Go watch Luke Thomas's videos or something if you want more details on that. But, the UFC ultimately won that case from my understanding. But they're effectively a monopoly, at least when it comes to the top talent. Like, they don't have competition the way they did from the late 90s to the earlier mid 2010s. Those days are just gone.